The closing of the door was a sound as final as a spadeful of dirt on a coffin lid. It was a solid oak door, one her husband, John, had hung himself 30 years prior. Now, her son Thomas stood on the other side of it, his face set like cold tallow, while his new wife, Clara, peeked from behind his shoulder, her expression a careful mixture of pity and impatience. Elspeth stood on the porch, the chill of the late autumn air already seeping through her thin wool shawl. The world she had known, the home she had built, the son she had raised, all of it was now on the other side of that oak door. "It is for the best, Mother," Thomas had said, his voice stripped of all warmth. "Clara needs the space. The town has a place for women like you." He had not said the word widow, nor had he said burden, but both hung in the air between them, heavier than the coming winter. He pressed a few worn bills and a folded piece of paper into her hand. $20 and a deed, a final accounting of her life's work. The deed was for the Folly, a patch of worthless, rock-strewn hillside John had bought in a fit of optimism decades ago. It was a family joke, a place of stunted pines and incessant wind, good for nothing but grazing the hardiest of goats. Now it was her only inheritance. She looked down at her hands, the skin wrinkled and spotted with age, but the knuckles still thick with the strength of a lifetime of work. In them lay everything she had left in the world, a pittance of money, a useless piece of paper, and the clothes on her back. At her feet, Blue, her late husband's grizzled hound, whined softly and nudged his head against her leg. He was old, scarred, and of no use for hunting anymore, another relic to be discarded. He was all she had. The community of Promise Creek watched her departure with the kind of morbid curiosity reserved for slow-motion disasters. They saw a woman in her 60s, cast out, with winter breathing down the neck of the valley. Pity was a cheap coin, and they spent it freely in whispers and sorrowful glances. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, polished a glass jar with a clean cloth as she entered his store, the bell above the door announcing her diminished status. "Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble of practiced sympathy. "I heard. A terrible business." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the polished counter. "The church is taking up a collection. And the poorhouse in the next county is clean, I hear. There's no shame in it." Elspeth looked at the shelves behind him, stocked with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and bolts of warm flannel, the architecture of survival. She did not want charity. Charity was a soft chair that slowly swallowed you whole. She wanted tools. "I'll not be going to the poorhouse, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. She unfolded the $20 bill on the counter. "I need an axe, a good one, and a shovel, a small cast-iron pot, 10 pounds of beans, a sack of flour, and salt." Gable stopped polishing the jar. He stared at the money, then at her. "An axe? Woman, what are you going to do with an axe? That land up on the ridge, it's a grave, not a home. You'll die of cold before the first real snow." "That may be," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But I'll die on my own land, not in a charity bed." The other customers in the store fell silent, listening. A rancher named Brant, known for his loud talk and cruel humor, let out a short, barking laugh. "Building a castle up on the Folly, are we, Granny?" he mocked. "The wolves will appreciate you saving them the trouble of digging a den." Elspeth ignored him. She pointed a steady finger at a row of seed packets. "And I'll take those. Turnips and kale." Mr. Gable sighed, the sound of a man defeated by a stubbornness he could not comprehend. He took her money and gathered the items. The axe was heavy, its hickory handle smooth and strong in her hands. The shovel was sharp. The sack of flour felt like a bag of stones. Each item was a denial of defeat, a declaration of a war she had no right to expect to win. She loaded her meager supplies into a burlap sack, hoisted it onto her back, and walked out of the store, the bell announcing her exit from the world of sense and reason. With Blue trotting faithfully at her side, she turned her back on Promise Creek and began the long walk toward the wilderness, toward the folly that everyone knew was worthless. The journey was a punishment. The road out of Promise Creek quickly dissolved into a rutted track that climbed relentlessly into the hills. The sack, filled with the dense weight of her new life, dug into her shoulders. Each step was an argument with the muscles in her legs, a debate with the burning in her lungs. The sun was a pale, watery disk in a gray sky, offering no warmth, only enough light to see the bleakness of the landscape. The cheerful greens of the valley gave way to the grim browns and grays of the high country. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the heat from her body and whispering of the winter to come. Blue stayed close, his old legs moving with a steady, enduring rhythm. He did not complain. He did not look back. He simply followed, his presence a silent, furry reassurance against the vast, uncaring emptiness of the land. They walked for hours, the town shrinking behind them until it was just a smudge of smoke in the valley floor. The world became rock, wind, and the rasp of her own breathing. She arrived late in the afternoon, when the light was failing and the cold had sharpened its teeth. And she saw it. The folly. It was worse than she remembered, worse than the jokes had ever conveyed. It was a scar on the face of the mountain, a slope of shattered shale and granite that offered no purchase for life, save for a few skeletal pines bent into permanent submission by the wind. And there, in the middle of this desolation, was the sheepfold. It was not a structure, it was the memory of one. A tumble of moss-covered stones, a collapsed rectangle of a wall no higher than her waist in most places, open to the merciless sky. A wave of despair, cold and vast as the landscape itself, washed over her. Her knees felt weak. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. Gable was right. Brant was right. The town was right. This was not a place to live. This was a place to die. The weight of the sack on her back was no longer the weight of tools and supplies. It was the weight of her own foolish pride. She slid it to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and hopelessness. Blue nudged her hand, whining, as if he could sense the breaking of her spirit. For a long moment she stood there, a tiny, defeated figure against a backdrop of immense indifference, and believed it was over before it had even begun. She forced herself to move, to walk the perimeter of the ruin. It was a duty, the final inspection of her own tomb. The wind clawed at her, relentless and personal. It found every gap in her clothing, every chink in her resolve. She ran a hand over the cold, damp stones of the collapsed wall. They were good stones, flat and solid, but they were scattered like lost teeth. Rebuilding it would take a strength she no longer possessed. She made her way to the back of the fold, where the ruined wall met a sheer cliff face that rose 20 feet into the air. Here, the wind was strangely absent. The air was still, the silence profound after the constant assault on her ears. She pressed her cheek against the cold stone of the cliff and felt nothing. No wind. She looked up. A thick, ancient curtain of ivy hung down the rock face, its leaves rustling faintly. Curiosity, a tiny, flickering ember in the ashes of her despair, stirred within her. She pushed the ivy aside. Behind it was not solid rock, but a dark, narrow opening, a vertical fissure just wide enough for her to squeeze through. A draft of air breathed out from the darkness, and she flinched, expecting it to be colder still. But it was not. It was cool, yes, but it was a cellar cool, a deep earth stillness, utterly devoid of the wind's biting chill. It was a different world. She took a hesitant step inside, her eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The fissure opened into a small cave, no larger than the front room of her old house. The air was damp and smelled of wet stone and deep earth. It was utterly silent. The howling of the wind was gone, reduced to a distant, muffled sigh. She held out her hand. The air that touched her skin was stable, unchanging. This was the secret. The rock of the hillside was a shield. The mountain itself was a wall, a barrier against the worst the world could throw at it. Then she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. Drip, drip, drip. A slow, steady, musical beat in the darkness. She followed the sound deeper into the cave. There, in the back corner, water was seeping from a crack in the rock, gathering in a small, clear pool on the stone floor before disappearing into the ground. It was clean. It was constant. It was life. Elspeth touched the water, the cold of it a shocking, beautiful affirmation. She looked around the dark, silent space. This was not a tomb. This was a womb. The worthless land, the laughable folly, held a hidden advantage that no one in Promise Creek could have imagined. The despair that had frozen her heart cracked and fell away, replaced by a grim, fierce resolve. The town was wrong. This was not the place she would die. This was the place she would live. The work began the next morning. It was a brutal, relentless assault on her aging body. The first task was to clear the rubble from the old sheepfold. She used her shovel and her bare, raw hands to move the fallen stones, one by one. Each stone was heavy, awkward, and cold. Her back screamed in protest. The muscles in her arms and shoulders burned with a fire that never went out. Blisters formed on her palms, broke and bled, the raw skin stinging with every rock she lifted. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her body refused to obey her will, then collapsed onto a bed of pine boughs just inside the cave entrance, with Blue curled beside her for warmth. Her sleep a dead-weight exhaustion that was its own kind of numbness. She sorted the stones as she cleared them, placing the large, flat ones in one pile and the smaller, irregular ones in another. This was not random labor. It was architecture. She was not just clearing a space, she was gathering her materials. Once the footprint of the old fold was clear, she began to build. She started against the cliff face, using the mountain as her foundation, and worked her way out, laying the stones with a painful precision. She had watched John build walls her whole life. The knowledge was there, buried in her memory, and it came back to her now through the language of her hands. She needed mortar. She found a deposit of dense, red clay not far down the slope, near a patch of marshy ground. She dug it out with her shovel, a task that left her gasping for breath, and hauled it back in her burlap sack, bucketful by bucketful. She mixed the clay with water from the seep and dry grasses from the hillside until it was a thick, sticky paste. With this primitive mortar, she sealed the gaps between the stones, her fingers chapped and caked with the cold, red mud. The walls rose slowly, an inch or two a day. Each new layer was a victory against the coming winter, a testament written in stone and sweat. While the mortar set, she turned her axe to the stunted pines. They were tough, their wood hardened by a lifetime of fighting the wind. Felling even one was a day's work. The axe felt like a lead weight in her hands, but she learned to use her whole body, to let the weight of the tool do the work. The rhythmic thud of the blade against wood became the heartbeat of her new life. She stripped the branches and cut the trunks into rough rafters, her arms trembling with the strain. Inside the cave, she built her sanctuary. She used the flattest stones to build a hearth against one wall, carefully constructing a flue that angled up toward a natural fissure in the ceiling. She spent 2 days painstakingly widening that fissure with a stout tree branch used as a pry bar, creating a chimney that would draw the smoke up and out of the cave, hidden from view on the windswept ridge above. The first fire she lit was a miracle. The dry pine caught with a roar, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a warmth that did not come from her own straining muscles. The smoke drew perfectly up the fissure. The stone walls of the cave began to drink in the heat, the cold, damp chill receding into the deep rock. That night, she slept in true warmth, the firelight dancing on the cave walls, Blue snoring at her feet. It worked. She was still there. Her systems grew, interconnected and logical. The cave was the warm heart, the kitchen and sleeping quarters. The rebuilt sheepfold, now with walls 6 feet high, became the outer room, a sheltered workspace and a future home for animals. She laid the pine rafters across the top of the stone walls and wove a thick mat of pine boughs between them. On top of this, she layered the sod she had carefully cut and saved from the clearing, grass side down. Finally, she sealed the entire roof with a thick plaster of her red clay. It was an ugly, lumpy roof, but it was solid, and it would hold the snow, using its weight as insulation. She fashioned a door from slabs of pine, lashed together with roots, heavy and solid. The water seep became a proper cistern. She dug out the pool, lined the bottom and sides with smooth, flat stones, and used more clay to seal the joints. Now, she had a small reservoir of clean, cold water right inside her home, a luxury no one in Promise Creek, with their outdoor wells and frozen pumps, would have in the deep of winter. Her final system was for food. She knew she could not survive on beans and flour alone. In the front of the cave, where a sliver of weak autumn light could reach from the entrance, she built 2 shallow boxes out of scrap wood and stone. Over the course of a week, she hauled bucket after bucket of the richest soil she could find from a sheltered hollow down the slope, a task that left her utterly spent. In these raised beds, she planted her seeds, the hardy kale that didn't mind the cold, and the turnips that would grow their roots in the cool, damp earth. It was a desperate gamble, a garden grown in near darkness, but it was a chance. With her shelter secure and her systems in place, she knew she needed one more thing, a source of life that could sustain itself. She took the last of her money, a few carefully saved dollars, and walked back to Promise Creek. She did not go to the mercantile this time. She went to a small farm on the outskirts of town, owned by an old man named Silas, whose wife she had once nursed through a fever. Silas looked at her, at the clay stains on her dress and the new hard lines on her face, and he did not mock her. He listened. When she was done, he nodded slowly. "The folly, eh? Always thought that place had a bad wind." He sold her 2 scrawny but healthy laying hens and a pregnant nanny goat for a price that was more gift than transaction. "She's due in the spring," he said, handing her the goat's rope. "Good luck to you, Elspeth. You've got more grit than most." Her return journey was a spectacle. An old woman, her back straight and proud, leading a goat and carrying 2 clucking chickens, walking toward the most desolate land in the county. A few people saw her from the road and shook their heads. When the news reached Mr. Gable, he simply polished his counter and said, "The poor soul's gone mad. She'll be feeding those animals to the wolves, or herself." The story solidified her legend in the town. She was no longer just a foolish outcast. She was a madwoman, a witch, building a nest of stones on a cursed hill. They gave her a name, the Fold Witch. The mockery was a distant noise, like the wind itself. It could not touch her in her world of stone and earth. Brant, the trapper, made a point of trekking up to her fold one day in early November. He stood outside her new wall, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a smirk on his face. He peered at the sod roof, the solid stone walls, the heavy door. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've built yourself a fine tomb. Real cozy. Mark my words, old woman. I'll come back after the thaw to pick through your bones. You'll be a frozen corpse by Christmas." Elspeth was inside, kneading a small lump of dough. She heard his words through the thick door, but did not grant him the courtesy of a reply. She had work to do. Her world had shrunk, but it had also deepened. Her life was a rhythm of essential tasks, a litany of survival. Deep winter arrived like a declaration of war. The sky turned to iron, and the wind began a relentless assault that would last for months. But inside her shelter, a routine of quiet order prevailed. Her day began before dawn, when she would stir the embers in the hearth back to life, the fire a warm, breathing creature in the heart of the cave. She would milk the goat, her hands moving with a familiar, soothing rhythm. The goat, whom she named Clover, and the two hens were housed in a corner of the outer fold, their body heat adding a small measure of warmth to the space, their presence a quiet comfort. She would collect the eggs, one, sometimes two a day, each one a perfect, precious jewel. She would water the small green shoots in her cave garden, which grew with an improbable, stubborn slowness in the dim light. The kale was spindly, the turnip greens pale, but they were alive. They were hers. The rhythm of her days was governed by the fire, the animals, and the slow, silent work of the roots in the earth. The world outside ceased to exist. Her reality was the smell of wood smoke and damp earth, the taste of goat's milk and fresh eggs, the steady warmth radiating from the stone walls. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of a small, functional kingdom of her own making. The winter offered smaller tests before the great one. A pack of wolves, their howls thin and hungry on the wind, circled the fold one night, drawn by the scent of the goat. Blue stood in the enclosed yard, his hackles raised, barking with a ferocity that belied his age. The wolves threw themselves against the stone walls, snarling and scratching, but the walls held. The heavy door did not budge. Elspeth stood on the other side, her old axe in her hand, her heart pounding, but she was safe. The wolves eventually gave up, their cries fading into the storm. Her shelter had been tested by the wild, and it had won. Another time, a week of freezing rain coated the entire ridge in a thick, treacherous sheath of ice. A chunk of ice and rock slid down the cliff face and partially blocked the fissure that served as her chimney. A plume of thick, acrid smoke billowed back into the cave, forcing her and the animals out into the biting cold of the fold. With Blue whining in distress, she had to climb the slippery, ice-encrusted rocks at the side of the cliff, using her axe to chip handholds, until she could reach the blockage and pry it loose with her shovel handle. She returned to the cave shivering and bruised, but with the smoke drawing clear once more. Each trial hardened her, proving the strength of her systems and her own resilience. She learned, she adapted, she endured. Then came the blizzard. It was not a storm, it was a physical entity, a monstrous white beast that descended from the north in the last week of January. The old-timers would later call it the Great White Hurricane of '83. It did not snow. The air itself seemed to congeal and fall to the earth. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a high, thin sound of pure malevolence. It came like a hammer, striking the world again and again, intent on breaking everything. In Promise Creek, the community failed. The town that had seemed so solid, so secure, was revealed to be a fragile collection of wooden boxes. The wind tore shingles from roofs and shattered window panes. The snow, heavy and wet, piled up in drifts that buried doorways and crushed the roofs of sheds and barns. Mr. Gable's grand storefront window, the pride of the town, imploded with a sound like a cannon shot, showering his precious goods with ice and snow. Families huddled in their homes, their confidence shattering with the temperature. Firewood, stacked in open-sided sheds, was buried under 10 feet of snow. Chimneys, poorly designed, clogged with ice and filled rooms with blinding smoke. The cold was an invading army, seeping through the walls, crawling across the floors. Livestock, trapped in their barns, froze to death standing up. The town's conventional wisdom, its lifetime of shared knowledge, proved useless against the storm's fury. Their world was collapsing. But on the Folly, Elspeth's world held. The wind screamed over the low, curved profile of her sod roof, unable to get a purchase. The snow piled on top, tons of it, but instead of crushing her, it embraced her. It became a thick, white blanket, burying her shelter even deeper, insulating her from the impossible cold outside. She was not fighting the storm. She was beneath its notice, tucked into the warm, stone heart of the mountain. Inside the cave, the fire in the hearth burned with a steady, hypnotic pulse. The massive stone walls, having absorbed heat for months, now radiated it back, creating a deep, penetrating warmth that the outside world could not touch. Clover the goat chewed her cud placidly. The hens clucked softly in their nesting box. The air was still and warm. The water in her stone cistern was cool and clear, unfrozen. From her stores, she baked a small loaf of bread. The smell filled the cave, a scent of impossible domesticity in the midst of an apocalypse. She was an island of life in an ocean of white death. On the third day of the storm, when the wind had dropped from a scream to a vicious moan, she heard a new sound. It was not the storm. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy outer door. Thump, thump, thump. Weak, but insistent. Blue erupted in a volley of barks, his body rigid. Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs. No person could be out in this. It had to be a branch, or the wind playing tricks. The banging came again, followed by a slumping sound, as if a body had fallen against the wood. She took the axe, her knuckles white, and unbarred the door. It swung inward, and a figure, a man so covered in snow and ice he was barely human, collapsed onto the stone floor of the fold. She knelt down, chipping the ice from his face. It was Brant, the trapper, the man who had laughed at her, who had promised to pick over her frozen bones. His face was a mask of waxy, dead-white flesh, his lips blue. One of his hands was frozen into a claw. He was barely breathing. He had seen the faintest wisp of smoke from her hidden chimney, a tiny plume that the wind tore apart instantly, and had crawled on his hands and knees for what must have been miles. That impossible signal, his only hope. For a single, cold moment, she looked at the man who had mocked her, who had wished her dead. Her firewood was finite. Her food was carefully rationed. To help him would be to risk her own survival. The memory of his cruel laughter echoed in her mind. Then she looked at his frozen face, the humanity stripped away by the cold, and saw only a person at the edge of death. Her choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative. She and Blue dragged him into the warmth of the inner cave. The sudden heat was a shock to his system. She cut away his frozen clothes with a skinning knife, the cloth stiff as wood. She packed his frost-bitten hands and feet in snow, the old way, to draw the frost out slowly. She brewed a thin, hot broth from boiled turnip greens and a pinch of salt, and forced it between his lips, drop by drop. Hours later, he began to speak, his voice a hoarse croak. He told her his cabin had been crushed by a massive snow-laden pine, He had barely escaped. But his wife Sarah and their 4-year-old son were in town. He had set them up in a small rented cabin on the edge of the settlement before he left, but their woodpile had been small. He was consumed by a terror that went deeper than the cold. He was sure they were freezing. He was sure they were dying. The storm had not broken, but it had lessened. A rescue was not impossible, merely suicidal. Elspeth looked at her woodpile, the precious fuel she had spent months gathering. She looked at her small stores of food. Then she looked at the desperate fear in the trapper's eyes. She went to the outer fold and began to load the small, crude sled she had built for hauling firewood. She piled it with split logs, with the 2 warm blankets from her own bed, and a pot of the hot broth, sealed with a wooden lid. She whistled for Blue. The dog would be her guide, his senses far better than hers in the blinding white world. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, pulled the rope of the sled over her shoulder, and stepped out into the storm to save the family of the man who had promised her she would be dead by Christmas. The journey to Promise Creek was a nightmare. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, sucking powder that fought her every step. The wind scoured her face with ice crystals. More than once, she fell, the sled tipping, and had to fight her way back to her feet, her lungs screaming for air that felt too cold to breathe. Only Blue, bounding ahead and then returning, his barks muffled by the snow, kept her moving in the right direction. She found Brant's cabin half buried in a drift, a thin curl of smoke barely visible from its chimney. Inside, she found Sarah and her son huddled under a single blanket, their fire down to a few dying coals. The boy was listless, his skin pale. They had been burning the furniture. Sarah looked at Elspeth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She knew who she was, the Fold Witch. Elspeth said nothing. She went to the fireplace, rebuilt the fire with the wood from her sled, and soon had it roaring. She heated the broth and made the mother and child drink. The warmth returned to the small cabin, and with it, the color returned to their cheeks. The sight of a healthy fire and the smell of food worked better than a town bell. A neighbor saw the smoke and struggled through the snow. Then another. Soon, a small group of townspeople had gathered, their faces gaunt with cold and hunger. Mr. Gable was among them, his fine coat torn, his face etched with a despair she had never seen. They stared at Elspeth, the woman they had pitied and dismissed, as she moved with quiet efficiency, giving orders, sharing out the last of her broth, showing them how to wrap hot stones from the fire to warm their beds. They stepped into the small cabin she had saved and were stunned. It was warm. The child was safe. Then they looked at her, this old woman who was supposed to be dead, and they saw not madness, but a strength that dwarfed their own. She had not just survived, she had brought survival with her, on a sled, through the heart of the storm. Mr. Gable approached her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked at the roaring fire she had built, at the child now sleeping peacefully, wrapped in one of her blankets. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "We called you a fool, Elspeth," he said, his voice cracking, the words swallowed by the wind. "We said you'd die up there." He shook his head, a look of awful clarity on his face. "My God, we were the fools. We were the fools all along." Elspeth looked at the man who had personified the town's condescending pity. She saw no triumph in his admission, only a shared suffering. She felt a lifetime of quiet resentment fall away, replaced by a simple, weary compassion. She said nothing of his mockery, nothing of her vindication. She simply picked up a brick that had been warming by the fire, wrapped it in a spare piece of cloth, and handed it to his wife. "For your children," she said softly. "Put this at the foot of their bed. It will hold the heat for hours." Her grace was more stunning than any accusation. It was a gift they had not earned, and they knew it. In that moment, she was not the outcast. She was the matriarch, the keeper of a wisdom they had forgotten. Her actions were her only sermon. Her survival was her only judgment. In the days that followed, as the storm finally broke and the people of Promise Creek began to dig themselves out, the town's relationship with Elspeth transformed. The derisive nickname, Fold Witch, died on their lips, replaced with something spoken in tones of awe. Mother Fold. Her home, the place they had called a folly, became a source of life. She organized the survivors, sending the strongest out with food and firewood to check on the isolated cabins, using her hard-won knowledge of the land to guide them. Her cave kitchen, with its endless supply of water and radiant heat, became a communal source of hot soup and baked bread for those who had lost everything. Brant, when he was well enough to travel, returned to town. He did not speak of his ordeal, but he looked at Elspeth with the humbled reverence of a man who owes his life and the lives of his family to a miracle. He became her fiercest defender, her most loyal helper, hauling wood and supplies for her without ever being asked. After the great blizzard, Promise Creek was never the same. The people had been humbled, stripped of their pride by the ferocity of nature. They began to visit Elspeth at her fold, not with pity, but with respect. They came to trade for her goat's milk cheese, for her winter-grown greens, for her advice. They asked how she built her walls to shed the wind. They marveled at the genius of her natural chimney, the simplicity of her sod roof. They looked at the earth not as something to be scraped clean for a foundation, but as a partner, a source of shelter and warmth. The lessons of the folly spread. New homes built in the valley were different. They were built lower to the ground, with thick stone walls and foundations dug into the hillsides to borrow the earth's warmth. The town learned. It adapted. It survived, stronger and wiser than before. Elspeth's story was told and retold, traveling with merchants and trappers to other settlements, a frontier legend of resilience and quiet ingenuity. Her little sheepfold became a landmark, a testament to the idea that what one person discards as worthless, another can use to build a world. Years passed. Elspeth remained in her fold, her life still one of quiet routine, but she was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of the community, its anchor, its wise woman. On a warm spring afternoon, she sat on a stone bench outside her wall, watching a group of children playing in the meadow below. Among them was Brant's son, now a strong, healthy boy. She was an old woman, her body stooped with age and labor, but her eyes were clear. She was surrounded by what she had built, not just walls of stone, but a life of purpose and a legacy of strength. She had been given nothing but a pile of rocks and the certainty of failure. From it, she had salvaged not only her own life, but the soul of a town. Her quiet victory was not over the community that had scorned her, but over despair itself. And in the warm afternoon sun, that was more than enough.